House and a frequent visitor to the Aspen Security Forum. Welcome back again, Anne. Then my boss, Anya Manuel, whose day job is working with Conji Rice, Bob Gates, and Steve Hadley at Rice Hadley Gates Manuel, but she's also our executive director. And the moderator will be Ryan Heath, who is the global technology correspondent at Axios, for a conversation on tech, AI, and competitiveness in American industry. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming them.
We know we're the last thing standing between you and a cocktail, so we're going to be brief and exciting.
Exactly, but we're amazed at how engaged you all are, so we're going to live up to the intensity that you're bringing as an audience. Anne, can I start with you? I hope we are all aware now of the AI executive order that the White House put out recently, but that's just one part of the administration's approach to regulating digital technologies. I was hoping you could sort of knit together or show us the connecting threads if we think across the board about AI, chips, crypto, spectrum, cybersecurity. There's a lot of it, but it's not always evident to people who don't follow this on a day-to-day basis. So can you sort of connect some of that together for us?
Absolutely. Good afternoon all, good evening all. It's really wonderful to be here today. And I think to that great question, the president is focused and recognized that technology really is the foundation both of our future economy. So a number of those programs were really down payments on our future economy and also key to our position on the global stage. Not only our competition with China, but also how we defend our international alliances and how we maintain our global leadership in each of those areas. So I'll give an example. Digital assets or crypto. The White House released, the administration released an executive order. And what was the goal of that? The goal of that was to say that U.S. financial leadership on the global stage, the role of American banks in cross-border payments, the role of the dollar, its dominance, is not only a key part of U.S. economic power, it provides us a set of national security tools from a sanctions perspective that is key to our ability to enforce global rules and norms. We want to promote innovation. Clearly, there's so much opportunity for innovation in that space, whether it's bringing down the cost of remittances, whether it's making it easier to settle transactions quickly by reducing the number of players in between. So the goal of that executive order was to say, how do we maintain the role of the dollar globally while also promoting innovation in digital finance, while also ensuring that we still can maintain those national security tools? AI, a similar example. The president has talked about the fact that there's both tremendous promise and also significant peril in AI. We see so many promising areas. One area that's really close to the heart of many in the White House is the role of AI in helping detect cancer more quickly, in helping advance drug discovery more quickly, and helping simulate some of the results in drug trials. The question is, how do we promote that innovation while also managing the risks? And by being a first leader in this space, bringing other countries along with us and maintaining that role as an international leader in tech and innovation that promotes our economy and our national security as well.
A quick follow-up, because there are a lot of international notes in these policies. What do you think is the most we can squeeze out of those multilateral systems now on these areas? Is it really about sort of mobilizing the people that want to keep rogue actors out of activity, or are there some minimum standards that we can get out of the United Nations or the G20, or is it really just going to have to be driven by allies at this point?
It's a great question, and I think it's very much all of the above. It matters differently in each of those technology areas. So let's pick artificial intelligence. That's an area where clearly we need to have global standards in terms of how you test models before they're deployed. What is adequate red teaming? What are the biggest risks from large language models, for example, in terms of accelerating potentially adversarial development of bioweapons, of offensive cyber capabilities. So the first piece was bringing large economies together to think about how we build global standards around those risks, even as the technology is evolving, and even as many of these questions are hard to solve. When I travel internationally, the first question we almost always get is the role of deep fakes in elections, and how we think about that, because free speech is something we're deeply proud of as democracies. Our elections are something we're deeply proud of, and the more real-looking images and videos, and how to ensure that our electorates know what is AI-generated content versus what is not. The reason watermarking was a key part of the first voluntary commitments. The reasons we're having the conversations with companies around accelerating the technological maturity of watermarks and saying, let's not make perfect the enemy of the good. Let's ensure content gets watermarked, along with helping to educate our electorates to know the difference between AI generated and not. There's a reason those are such important areas. So in sum, it'll evolve technology by technology, but our role is both ensuring that we can use these forums to help educate about the risks, to help promote the approaches to address them, and also build partnerships for the promise. So the US and the EU signed an administrative agreement to use AI in 5 areas of social good. For example, in the field of emergency management, how do we ensure that satellites collecting information use identification, so in the event of an emergency, we can more rapidly and effectively guide people fleeing a fire, fleeing a flood. Those are international challenges that we want to use technology together with as many allies and partners as we can to promote that quickly.
Thank you. Anya, you're deeply connected, not just in San Francisco, but wider Silicon Valley. Some of the folks that run those companies and found those companies think by definition they're the smartest people in the room. How are you sensing their reactions to all this government action in space that they have sometimes had to themselves until now?
Thank you, Ryan. That's a great question. And when I'm not working with the Aspen Security Forum, which I love, I live out in Silicon Valley, I work with tech companies all day long. Let me just back up a little bit. The Biden administration, Anne and her team and the others working on tech have done an enormous amount. You know, we were nowhere thinking through competitively about technology, thinking holistically about how do we set the standards, how do we compete with China as the pacing threat here. And boy, we've come a huge long way. And I think at the same time, Silicon Valley has come a long way. When I used to talk about national security and technology and intersecting those two things in 2019, people in Silicon Valley didn't want to hear it. They were doing a lot of business with China. They were making a lot of money. They didn't want to hear that things were going to change. Well, we have really come a long way in the last 3 or 4 years, and that's all to the good and to your credit and to all of those working with you. If we take a step back and look at why we're doing this, it's partly to promote our own innovation ecosystem, but it's also because we have a pacing threat in China. And if you look at what the US government has done and how industry has seen it, it's 2 things. There's the defensive steps, export controls, outbound investment screenings. And those were important, but in my view, and I think in the industry's view, we're kind of reaching the limit of what those defensive things can do. I think Silicon Valley sees this not as a decoupling from China, but as a great race. And in a race, you can hobble your opponent, or you can try to run faster yourself. So I think the view from the Valley is we've done a little bit of hobbling, but now it's time to do all of the steps we need to do to actually promote our own innovation and push forward.
So to go on the offense, basically.
To go on the offense.
Okay. Anne, AI is clearly going to transform intelligence. The US typically has an edge when it comes to intelligence. How can we use AI to keep that edge? But B, how can we do it without losing who we are? Because just using technology to its endpoint, you can lose who you are in that process.
It's a great question. 2 of the toughest problems we have in the intelligence community is making sense of vast amounts of data that's collected. And the second piece, making vast amounts of intelligence reports that are generated available, summarized, and accessible to those who can use it quickly and effectively during decision-making. So, for example, on the second, think of a chat GPT for tens of thousands of intelligence reports coming from each, whether it's human collection, whether it's signals intelligence, that's available on the desktops of analysts or policymakers who can ask a question immediately. Tell us, for example, what is the likelihood of a North Korean launch of an ICBM? There's a number of factors that an individual, or more likely a team of individuals in the intelligence community will put together to try to answer that. That process is, big components of that today are manual. big components of that take time to pull together. And the most satisfying work for people working in the community is answering the question. So if we can accelerate the time and automate that work, both to pull that work together, as well as to make it available to a policymaker. Similarly, we now see commercial companies, I'm sure Anya engages with them all the time, ups the process from collection, analysis, to delivery of outcomes. So traditionally, for example, satellites are a very interesting type of collection, and the process was, let's gather all that data, let's have humans, or in some cases machine learning, try to identify what they see, and then generate reports out of that. If those first two steps can be collapsed, one can both accelerate, bring down the costs, and consider that as commercial tipping to the much more sophisticated national government platform. So really great benefits there. I would note to your question, there's a flip side, which is we're not the only ones who have access to that. So ensuring that we also think about maintaining our lead and what it takes to not only be first, but also ensure that we've can manage in a world where those kinds of what were traditionally advanced capabilities are available to a whole range of actors is a second really important area for focus and study.
I can actually throw back an example, a really positive example that's adjacent to intelligence that I wrote about today. And I would have had no idea if I wasn't doing this for a living. There are companies now contracted by Customs and Border Protection that work to break up the fentanyl supply chain, but much earlier in the supply chain before the fentanyl is even finished. And they use something called a knowledge graph to track unusual movements in the precursor chemicals that go into making up fentanyl. They can track that across 450 million companies, many of them shell companies around the world, and how this moves into transit countries. And then they can shut down the production or stop the production from happening in the first place, avoiding having to ferret through 83 million vehicles that cross into the border each year. So that's a really good example of how you can use AI.
Yeah.
I sense you wanted to jump in, Anya.
Well, this is exactly the kind of thing that we need to do to stay in the lead. So this makes my point previously that we should be mostly on the offense. If you look at AI, the export controls on chips, on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, the second set of export controls that just came out this October, they had an important effect to slow down China's building of large language models. But make no mistake, the Chinese are excellent entrepreneurs, they're excellent technologists, and that advantage is only going to last so long. Mm-hmm. And in certain things like visual recognition, autonomy, Chinese AI is excellent, first rate. Mm-hmm. So we've got to do more to accelerate ourselves. I'll give you one example. The Chips and Science Act, hard fought, really important bill. Raimondo and Commerce deserve a huge amount of credit for this. The part that no one noticed was that it was actually the Chips and Science Act. There was supposed to be a huge appropriation for federal government R&D, and that is hopelessly underfunded. It was authorized. It's this year $7.5 billion underfunded, and every year you're going to see that being less and less and less funded because, by the way, guys, there's no one lobbying for it. So
we're skewed far too much to chips and not enough to science.
Well, we're just underfunding the science part that was authorized.
Yep.
And we can dig ourselves out of that hole, but it's something that Congress needs to pay attention to, and I worry that sometimes they're not.
We've had, I'll give a personal view here. I think we've had a somewhat skewed set of AI debates this year, where we've over-rotated on existential risk around AI, but we have kind of under-rotated on more immediate risks. And that ranges from the bias and discrimination risks, but I think maybe we're forgetting that competitiveness or loss of competitiveness is also a risk. We're not weighting that correctly. Any reactions to that thought?
I'll let you go first.
I think you're very right with regard to one risk is not using AI to advance areas of our economy, areas of our government where it could make operations more efficient and allow for new and creative uses we may not have thought of before. So to your point, education is a really interesting sector. You have a class full of children. Even the best teacher has a hard time tailoring for each child so that they learn the most. Most cities have operation centers, call centers, where people call in and ask for various things. The training for those call centers is incredibly, how do you train someone for the wide range of questions they'll get, the wide range of city services? Those are two great examples where AI can help make both societal advancements, can help make government work much more efficiently, and it's a challenge, and it's really important that we take advantage of that. In the area of from a broader economic perspective, think about, and this is a tie to your earlier question about spectrum.
Yep.
Fascinating space to think about UAVs monitoring infrastructure, electricity infrastructure around the country to identify down lines, to identify shrubbery that's growing to where there'll be disruption to electricity services. The promise of that in terms of how AI can enable more rapid identification of problems and make maintenance updates far more efficient, combined with, of course, just the broader set of uses that kind of connectivity allows, are just great examples of how we can come up with new creative ways for companies to use their resources, bring down their costs, and make investments in the most optimal ways.
Anything to chip in, or?
No, this is great. I'm happy that we're having an optimistic, positive conversation
well,
about
let's
AI.
turn
and
to
a national
cybersecurity then, and let's
conference.
bring it down a notch.
Well, on cybersecurity, yeah, exactly. I was part of an AI conference last week in Silicon Valley, and it was all this. It was sort of, oh, this is the bright new future, and we're going to find the new cancer drugs, and it's going to be so amazing. And I was kind of the national security skunk at the picnic, talking about the stuff we hear a lot more. And I think the threats are really in the national security space, how AI intersects with other technologies, whether it's cyber. Now that cuts two ways. On the offense, is it gonna write its own malicious code, but then it makes the defense much easier and much stronger as well? How does it intersect with bioweapons? How does it manage nuclear deterrence? But on the positive side, there is a huge amount. And if you look at what's happening in the business community, what we see is it's being integrated everywhere very quickly, and with Anne's stewardship, hopefully responsibly.
So Anne, over to you. I've probably got three prongs of questions here. I'll start with two. You, or the White House rather, launched a Cyber Trust Mark initiative last year, and that was really aimed at shifting the industry upwards to build in more protections, for example, Internet of Things device makers. I want to know sort of what's the latest news with that. And then I had a question. Apple's put out a new report around the state of risks to personal data, and their view essentially is more encryption is better. And I wonder whether you agree with that assessment, given everything you get to see across your desk.
So thank you for lifting up the Cyber Trust Mark program. Folks who work cybersecurity each day, defense is a much harder challenge than offense. Why? Because there's pretty much no cost to many attackers. We've shifted to a software-based world. Even from a defense perspective, we talk about software-based military capabilities in that way. And because of those two components, and because of, as a country, we're a country of rules, policies, and laws, and that means that government monitoring of U.S. networks is something that we consider beyond the pale because we value privacy of our citizens. We also are, and a key part of the reason the U.S. is leading in innovation on the global stage is because we often promote innovation and consider regulation and consider managing for the risks second. I think there's real lessons from cybersecurity as we approach AI in that we waited far too long to put in place, for example, minimum cybersecurity protections for critical infrastructure. And I think one of the reasons you saw in the AI executive order a very clear focus on approaching the safety and risks of deployment of AI in critical services, that was a lesson learned from our lessons in cybersecurity, where we said before artificial intelligence use is accelerated across critical services, we need to put in place real controls for how it's tested, what kind of decisions, where there's a human in the loop, the explainability of those uses because of that. So the goal of the Cyber Trust Mark program is to say there are billions and billions of connected devices, actually 4 times more than internet-connected individuals today. How do we incentivize companies building fitness monitors, home alarm systems, to build them secure? And the goal was to say, there's a government standard, let's model it on Energy Star, where the average individual does not know what makes a device earn its Energy Star label, but when they're shopping online, they can look for that. So the Cyber Trust Mark program, by the end of 2024, there will be labels on products in stores for those products that meet the government security standard.
And you're on track.
Right now, we are on track.
Okay,
We are on track. One approaches any policy.
So there is good news in cybersecurity.
There is.
It's not all bad.
The FCC got out its rule, and it's out for public comment. As the chairwoman will say, almost all the comments they got back were positive, which was a very good experience for them.
That never happens.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to spoil the streak here, but my last question, and we've just got a couple of minutes left, it's on ransomware. There has been a huge uptick in ransomware. It's really leading democracies that have been the main targets of ransomware attacks. It's starting to hit the infrastructure of Middle America. I think there are 60 credit unions under attack right now. Lives are at risk when it hits local hospitals. It seems like a really obvious area where the government can support people to not be out on a limb on their own, giving into blackmail. What is the role for government there?
It's a great question. First, a quick fact. U.S. entities paid $2.3 billion in ransoms in the last 2 years. Second, quick fact. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence sat down with ransomware negotiators. Yes, it's a business. And asked them the question of what have they learned. And their answer was, companies who had effective offline backups recovered more quickly than those who paid a ransom. So let's bring those two elements together, combined with the last 3 years of extensive efforts by government, by private sector, improving resilience, disrupting criminal actors and their infrastructure, trying to trace illicit crypto payments and sanction those crypto virtual asset service providers who move illicit money. And I think at the end of the day, criminals will go where the money is, which is why we've started having just a discussion in the US government policy circles right now of, is it the time to put in place a regime that prevents ransom payments unless there's some approval and they come in for a government waiver for those where lives may be at risk? Because the combination of knowing that good cybersecurity practices, a backup, will help an entity recover faster, and the fact that with this much money fueling ransomware attacks, there will only be more of that. A final piece on that, to your point about hospitals. We also recognize that we need to put in place requirements so every sector does the basics. For example, I think reports are that for the very significant recent hospital attacks, the particular vulnerability that was exploited was on the government's known exploited vulnerability catalog for 4 weeks by that time. So watch this space. More will be. We're working very closely with HHS and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid to put in place those minimum practices for healthcare.
We've landed the plane on time. A final word to you, Anya.
Perfect. One final point is the reason you are seeing rational, thoughtful executive orders, regulation coming out of the U.S. government right now is because people like Anne, Arati Pragapakar, a few others scattered throughout the U.S. government have technical chops. There still isn't enough of that. We at the Aspen Security Forum have been doing a lot of work on the STEM workforce, on educating people in technical disciplines, and then getting them either full-time or part-time or as weekenders into the U.S. government. So if you know people who are interested in this space, please make sure they come and they give back to the U.S. government. And this is just too important a space and it's too easy to mistranslate to have people who don't understand these disciplines. So I'm grateful to you and everything you all are doing.
I do have to note, all of that work, of course, is built on amazing teams, and I echo the call to action. We need people in government who've worked in the private sector, who have technology chops. Please raise your hand. There's a ton of work waiting for you.
Come be the smartest person in the room in government. That's the message.
You too can work 18-hour days.
Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. Thank you for everyone watching online. Thank you, Anne and Anya.
Thanks very much. I'll just make a brief remark before Anya closes us out for the day. First of all, thank you for sticking with us. One thing you are maybe aware of is the purpose of the Aspen Institute.